Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this session on transit asset management. My name is Aaron Kazuki, and I am from AECOM, a consulting manager there with the Strategic Planning Group and the National Transportation Planning Group. We have a wonderful speaker panel today that focuses on looking at how we are implementing asset management in the transit industry. I've had the opportunity to attend some of the other sessions, and this is one of the few sessions that will focus specifically on how we are doing this in the transit industry. Since the Federal Transit Administration's final rule on asset management was published, transit agencies have been required to develop asset management plans and establish performance measures. And so as a result, we've worked with these agencies to help craft these plans and implement these processes. And so we have two speakers today. We've got Laura Zale from SEPTA, and we've got Robert Peskin from AECOM who will speak to this. First up will be Laura Zale. Let me just get this presentation queued up here. There we go. All right, so first up, we've got Laura Zale, and she is the manager of asset management at SEPTA. Her work in developing an asset management program, coordinating construction projects with Amtrak, and performing public relations for SEPTA's Building the SEPTA Future program, and it has enabled Laura to learn the public transportation business from the ballast up. She is the principal author of SEPTA's Transit Asset Management Plan, and she has a passion for collaborating with transit agency peers to advance the practice of asset management. She is the chair of the APTA Asset Management Standards Working Group, as well as the co-chair of APTA's Performance-Based Planning Subcommittee. She holds degrees in civil and architectural engineering from Drexel University. And she also is an instructor at the NTI FTA TAM 201 course as well. So with that, I'll leave it off to Laura to take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. Not blinking anymore.
There we go.
So good afternoon. It's exciting to speak in an event at Penn State. It's a little bit weird for me because I am a Drexel grad. My brother was a Penn State grad, so we always had this little competition going on about that. But you guys do win on the ice cream department, so here we are. Next year, hopefully, we'll be able to go stop at the creamery after the asset management session. Next slide, please. So I thought as a part of the presentation, I really wanted to step back, particularly because many of our attendees might be more of on a DOT focus or might be from an MPO perspective, to give you a little bit about the background of asset management as it pertains to transit and give you a little framework for what we did at SEPTA. The FTA established the asset management requirements as a part of MAP 21 and then reestablished them as part of the FAST Act. And it was really a fundamental focus on a shift in prioritization to maintenance, system preservation, and achieving a state of good repair. Next slide, please, Aaron. So why did the FTA get involved in business processes and interested in asset management per se? This was a result of understanding that there was a fundamental idea that there was a national state of good repair backlog upwards of $100 billion. And there's an understanding that the needs are much greater than would ever be feasible to fund through even current or very practical funding levels. So the idea was that agencies would have to reprioritize their funding dollars wisely to optimize their spending. And also the FTA realized that they needed a uniform way to report on the condition of assets on a national level to really see how good or prudent the investments that the grantees were. Next slide, please. This concept of asset management in and of itself isn't anything new. It was, however, not being uniformly applied in the United States transit arena. And it's one of these concepts where it certainly looks practical, looks like something that's really common sense to do. But as we found out, as we started to look into the problem a little bit more, it's a lot more complicated than just simply taking your capital asset inventory from your accounting department and applying that to a cost and decay model. Next slide, please. The FTA really did the due diligence when they started to develop their asset management requirements for the industry. And at the end of the day, while there were some requirements that everybody has to follow, they're not particularly prescriptive in how you follow them when you get down to the nuts and bolts at your agency. And you can see it when you read the requirements, they really did their homework and looked to a lot of other existing business models, particularly PAST 55, ISO 55000, and the Institute of Asset Management framework for asset management. Like I said, the FTA does not endorse any particular model. They do not require you to be certified by IAM or ISO, but they do say that you should do the best thing for your agency as you see fit. Next slide, please. So what are the actual FTA TAM requirements? The actual deliverables consist of process improvements as well as some recording requirements. Agencies were required to have a compliant asset management TAM plan by October 1st of 2018. There's an understanding that you're going to coordinate with your state and your NPO. You self-certify your compliance and you report that as a part of your triennial review. And there were a number of targets and new forms in the National Transit Database. And that includes a narrative report where each agency has to explain their progress toward achieving their targets and how they might be changing those targets based on upcoming funding scenarios. Next slide, please. So like I said, the FTA wasn't super prescriptive in following a particular model, but when you look at the rule very closely, you will see that there's a really close correlation to other practices, particularly the IAM model. The 9 components of a Tier 1 transit plan, or even the 4 elements of a Tier 2 smaller agency plan, can all be mapped back to best practices as identified in the IAM framework. Next slide, please. So how did the 6 largest transit property, multimodal, legacy, and with a history of funding challenges accomplish the development of their asset management program? Our journey really started with our capital needs inventory and the development of our state of good repair model that we use to articulate the implications of different funding scenarios. This is really the first time that we took an enterprise approach to bringing all of the assets under one umbrella and bringing them into one model to be able to prioritize decision making. We spent a long time looking at processes and performing gap analyses, procuring software tools, implementing those software tools, EAM system implementation. And finally, we worked on our asset plan, management plan itself. And we were able to finish all of that in time for the October 1st, 2018 deadline. Next slide, please. And when you look at our plan and you look at our capital plan, you can see that right away we were able to incorporate our FTA TAM targets into our capital program, whether that be our revenue vehicles, our service equipment, our facilities, or our guideway. Next slide, please. Bringing the fleet to a state of good repair is a huge component of our program, and it's something that we prioritize even when our funding is at its very, very tightest. The other thing that's very important not only is fleet procurement, but also fleet maintenance. This is especially important at SEPTA, where our rail vehicles are all approaching the end of their useful life benchmark. Next slide, please. Another area where you can see the direct impact of our asset management program is the facilities that we have chosen to invest in over the next 12 years. The stations that rank lowest in all of our condition assessments are the ones that are identified in our capital budget. On the top of the slide, you see Fern Rock Station, which is a relatively new one, but had some structural issues that is under construction now. City Hall Station is probably the one that is in the most amount of need at the moment. So that one is still under design. However, we've advanced several infrastructure projects in order to facilitate operations when that station goes under construction. We've had to do a lot of upgrades to the signal system and the power system in order to facilitate the outages and workarounds that we're going to have to work on that particular station. The other thing that you'll notice when you look at our capital plan is we might not have the funding or the outage windows to perform station projects at one time. However, we will break station projects into smaller things in order to fund them to mitigate the areas of most concern. Next slide, please. Now, the guideway performance metric is one that when SEPTA looked at it, we found that it wasn't particularly helpful for us to make decisions right away. We found when we looked at our slow zone reports and the condition of our track, we found out that most of our slow zones are not due to conditions that need to be mitigated. However, we do have a lot of legacy infrastructure that's been left over from our predecessor railroad operators, the Reading Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad. So when you look at how we're prioritizing investments on the guideway, yes, we are bringing things to a state of good repair, but we're really looking at the areas that cause the greatest amount of passenger delay or operational impact. You will see when you look at our capital program that the areas that have had the highest levels of passenger delay, particularly Wayne Interlocking and Schuylkill Interlocking, are being funded in the next 5 years. West and 20th Street also will be funded relatively soon as well. 16th Street Junction is actually going through some studying and evaluation to make sure that we understand what the appropriate capital action is before we make the renovations there. However, it is important to see, like we look at all of this sort of data from the assets when we select our infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. So like I said, we were at a base level of compliance on October 1st, 2018, and we could have said, hey, we're good. We've got our plan. We'll update it in 4 years and we'll continue doing what we're doing. However, we did recognize when we're going through things that there are a lot of ways that we can improve our asset management program to really bring it to the robust system that it needs to be to run a large legacy property. I'm going to talk about some of the improvements that we're making now, and you'll notice that I lean on the IAM framework to collate our thoughts. Again, we're not IAM certified. I'm not saying that you should be, but it's a good way to kind of organize and strategize about what actions you want to take and when. Next slide, please. I think the biggest thing that a lot of agencies are continuing to work on is this idea of data collection. Your program is only as good as the data and your confidence in the data that you collect about your asset portfolio. An area we are working on, we know what we have, we generally know what condition it is, but we are still working on improving our processes to collect data from the assets throughout their lifetime and improving this data collection procedure. Next slide, please. Like I said, the first time we did our asset inventory, we were mostly concerned about identifying the location and condition of each of the assets. And sometimes we did it at a pretty high level. Our next phase of our asset management program is really focusing on talking to the asset maintainers, to the folks that are actually out in the field keeping these assets going day in and day out, to make sure that we're collecting our data at a level of granularity that makes sense for them to be able to articulate their needs to the decision makers at headquarters. This is an iterative process. This is something that you might go at a different level of granularity depending on the assets that you're working with. But at the end of the day, we've really been striving to work on a level of information that works for the maintenance staff and the chief operating officers in the headquarters building. Next slide, please. So one of the little silver linings of the COVID-19 situation was that we were able to really catch up on some of our backlog of data collection and inspection. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were not running service on a lot of our rail lines, and we had a lot of staff that we could not keep at their headquartered locations. So we redeployed a lot of our staff to perform architectural, ADA, structural inspection of our facilities. We also had them do a complete overhaul of our culvert inspection program. We were able to identify and locate a lot of legacy assets, some of which had not been able to be detected since the original valve maps from the Pennsy and the Reading Railroads. And we established some future inspection frequencies and the resource requirements. It was the first time we could really look to a comprehensive effort and pinpoint exactly how many people we needed to perform these particularly important inspections. Next slide, please. We're also working to continue to promote a culture of asset stewardship. We hear this buzz phrase, asset management touches everybody. It really does, but what does that mean, particularly to 9,600 employees at the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority? There's a couple of ways that we're promoting this idea of stewardship. One is to fill our vacancies on our TAM team. We are short-staffed at the moment. We are working to identify the right kind of folks to bring in to help with our data collection and data modernization processes. That being said, my team is a team of 4 at the moment. I'm not going to get more staff, particularly the way that funding is right now. So we've really been working hard to network with subject matter experts that can really represent each of our asset classes and work with them on a TAM stewardship team in order to make sure that everything is getting incorporated into our program at the appropriate level of granularity. Another thing that I bring up, and this is going to sound weird coming from an engineer and an asset management program, is we run the management rotation program for the SEPTA engineering and vehicle engineering departments. We make sure that all of the staff is getting trained so that they have the ability to work on the railroad and on the transit side of the house. We get them trained so that they can work with Amtrak assets. We then rotate them around through the authority so they spend a few weeks in each of the divisions learning. They walk the track, they spend some time on the wire train, they spend a month in my shop learning how to monitor condition and be able to articulate asset needs to external stakeholders. And finally, we are working on courses to promote our activities to our mid-level managers, and those will be rolling out next year. Next slide, please. A lot of this information and this promotion of the concept of asset steward is really impingent on communication. You hear this a lot, that you're constantly you're almost marketing your program over and over again, whether it's to folks inside your authority or folks outside of your agency. APTA has put together 2 fantastic resources if you need some help in how to communicate within different stakeholders, whether they be folks in your maintenance department or whether they be your board or folks at your MPO. And the URLs for those are on those slides. Next slide, please. One thing that I'm particularly proud of through the implementation of our asset management program is how we've been able to really show how we're mitigating risks in our capital budget. You can see how many of our projects are mitigating known safety issues, are dealing with operational risk, and we've really started to talk about climate vulnerability and how to mitigate those things. That's one of the key areas that we're really working, that we're hoping that our life cycle delivery improvements will help us to mitigate these risks a little sooner. Next slide, please. Climate vulnerability is a very big thing, and it's one of these issues that unfortunately you need to rely on folks outside of your authority usually to work on. We joke around that, boy, it would be easier to run the trains with or maintain the assets if people weren't using them. It'd be a lot easier to mitigate your conditions if we were working in a bubble. But the fact of the matter is a lot of these issues need to be dealt with on a regional level. And we've identified stakeholders depending on which projects to work with. We're looking at vulnerabilities of right-of-way drainage. We are waterproofing tunnels. We're looking at areas of slope stability, areas where just stormwater over time has really taken its toll on our asset portfolio. This is another area where you can really lean on your external stakeholders to help you really understand what the true enterprise needs of your assets are and how different projects can help make things better for your entire region. Next slide, please. Finally, we're really working on an area where thinking through your strategy and working on your decision-making process can really shape the flavor, the tone of your overall capital budget. We're in the process of setting better policies to make sure that system preservation and addressing the areas of greatest concern are the areas that are being reflected in our program. Now, many of our projects are in these areas, but having a policy in place will help to really drive the question of what is the next action on this asset. And more, we're finding that the answer isn't replace it in kind. Next slide, please, Erin. So these are the conversations that we have to have in order to support and improve our decision-making processes. Those ongoing activities are really taking a step back and realigning our inventory to the level required for decision-making. We're developing our long-range infrastructure and facility plans, and we're working to develop communication strategies to share information. That's a really important thing for us in these particular times. We're going through some management changes. You just met our new general manager. She takes a little different spin on the world than our previous one did. So we've worked really hard to make sure that we're articulating the needs of the assets to not only our new general manager, but all the folks that she needs to work with in order to help keep SEPTA running the way that it is. So those are some of the things that we're doing at SEPTA to improve our asset management processes. But the thing that I'm really excited about is the thing that Bob's going to talk about next, which is our improved decision support model. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation, and it's good to hear the progress that SEPTA has made with its TAM program. So as Laura said, the next person up will speak to a specific aspect of implementing your TAM plan, which is specifically focused on decision support tools. Let me just queue up the presentation in a second here. Okay. And All right, so we've got up next is Robert Peskin. He is a senior consulting manager with AECOM and also my colleague. We've worked together for over a decade at this point, so I've been very familiar with his work with transit agencies in assembling asset inventories, and estimating state of good repair backlog and future state of good repair needs, and examining the impact on future asset condition that results from not funding the backlog and future needs on a timely basis. He's worked with and managed the development of transit asset management plans for systems in LA and in Orlando. He's also managed state of good repair analyses for the MBTA in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Vancouver, and British Columbia, Dallas, San Jose, San Francisco, Miami, and Fargo, North Dakota, and also for the Amtrak Northeast Corridor. So, and he's also developed the first ever Washington Metro long-range infrastructure needs in 1987. He is a co-chair of the TRB subcommittee on transit capital replacement, and he is also a member emeritus of the TRB committee on transit management. He and I are both working on the TAM and CIP tool for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Bob.
All right, thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Laura, for the great introduction, which provides a lot of context for what I'll be talking about this afternoon. So we're going to be talking about, advance one slide, if you would, Aaron. We'll be talking about decision support tools and their role in asset management. The context here is largely in terms of what the Federal Transit Administration requires in developing a transit asset management plan. And as you'll see in a couple slides, the decision support tool is a key element of that. But it supports more than just the development of the transit asset management plan. It has a role in projecting out transit asset performance, which is useful in the National Transit Database report. We'll talk about the data, where it comes from. We'll talk about the math behind the analysis, talk about how the analysis works. And then we'll have a tangible example that we did several years ago at SEPTA, work that's soon going to be updated as SEPTA updates its data. And we'll conclude with some next steps of sort of where do we go from here. And then we've got room at the end for discussion, and I have some questions that will hopefully stimulate some of the thinking of the participants in this conference. Next slide. On the left side are the 9 elements of a Tier 1 transit asset management plan. All the transit agencies, over 100 vehicles, and all the rail agencies have to do all 9 elements. The smaller Tier 2 agencies only have to do the first 4. But all agencies have to apply a decision support tool. We'll talk in a moment about what that tool is and what it does. But in the end, what the tool needs to do is what's in the box on the right side of the screen. It needs to address these fundamental questions. How big is the backlog? What assets are already beyond their useful life? And related to that, looking ahead, what assets will become beyond their useful life in future years? Those are relatively straightforward questions to answer and can be done with pen and paper or with a simple spreadsheet. But it gets more complicated when we ask the third and most important question, which is, what if we don't fully fund those needs? What happens? Most importantly, what happens to asset performance looking ahead? And that's where the use of these tools really gets interesting. So what are these tools? Next slide talks to this. FTA's requirement for a decision support tool to support a transit asset management plan are not real specific. It needs to be analytical. It needs to be inventory based. It has to be fact based. So it's not just the opinion of knowledgeable staff. There has to be data behind it. And whatever the mathematical procedure that's used, it needs to be repeatable. The point of the application of the tool is to project future needs and to prioritize those needs. And in so doing, it supports decision making. Now, it can be relatively sophisticated software. Aaron clicked through a couple times here. It could be a tool like the FTA TermLite tool, or a tool, for example, that we developed for the MBTA in Boston, and a tool that we're currently applying at the MTA in New York. It could be the TAPT, TAPT tool that was developed as part of the Transit Cooperative Research Program. There's also many commercial products that are out there that provide an ability to really get into the details and do relatively sophisticated optimization calculations. But it doesn't have to be software, and FTA is pretty clear about that. It just needs to meet the above needs. It could just be a set of index cards. Do that final click. There's some index cards. So, if you're I don't know, if you've got a dozen buses in a relatively small system, you may not even need a spreadsheet to do this. You just need a process that's repeatable, that's based on the hard facts about each asset. Next slide. The way the tool supports the development of the Transit Asset Management Plan and projecting performance measures is shown in this animation. Click, Aaron, please. So developing the Transit Asset Management Plan, we develop an asset inventory, which tells us information about each asset. Click again. And that feeds into the decision support tool. Click again. It goes through a prioritization process that addresses how assets age over time and with use, what the operating impacts are of that aging. It gets into issues of risk and criticality, and may also address a set of strategic or corporate goals. Click again. The calculation is subject to a set of constraints. Certainly a funding constraint, a budget constraint, but it may also address operational constraints, particularly operational sequencing constraints. You can't do A before B, and you can't do B and C simultaneously. More sophisticated tools get into those types of constraints. Click again. The tool may also include a list of needs that are identified by the agency staff through a call for projects. Click again. And what comes out of this then is a set of line item needs associated with each asset. Click again. And this then goes into a list of projects. It may include bundling some of the asset-related needs into projects. This then goes through, typically in most agencies, review by senior management and by the governing board. And this then goes into developing the Transit Asset Management Plan. And as Laura mentioned before, this information is then shared with the MPO, which is used in developing the TIP, which is a relatively short-range document. All of this is part of developing the asset management plan. But the use of decision support tools can also support the development of the asset management portions of the NTD report, both in updating the asset inventory and in projecting out what next year's performance is going to be, asset management performance is going to be, which can be used for selecting the targets that are reported, next year's targets that are reported in the NTD report. Next slide. Where's the data come from? Well, typically there's three sources where transit asset data can come from. Click again. One is the maintenance work order system. The second is the capital programming process, which may have a completely independent inventory from the maintenance work order system, which supports the development of the TAM plan and the NTD report, as I mentioned in the prior slide. And the third source, click again, is from various financial management resources within an agency, click again, which includes information from the accounting department, from a grants department, supporting their activities. What's the ideal? The ideal is that they all come from a common place. And that's certainly consistent with what the International Standards Organization is suggesting in ISO 55000. It's an ideal that many transit agencies are working toward. Some agencies have already gotten there, like Los Angeles Metro, for example, is there. Others are moving in that direction. New York MTA is an example of one of those agencies. Next slide. So how does the tool work? Well, we start with an asset inventory, click. And that asset inventory is aged over time, click again. So in the first year of the analysis, it will generate a set of needs, which are prioritized. And I'll talk in a moment about a method for prioritization. We then apply a funding constraint and spend the money in the order of priority until the funding is exhausted. That becomes the first year set of actions. But you'll note that some needs did not get funded. The model then continues to age all the assets, identifies the needs in the subsequent year and prioritizes them. But some of those needs from the prior year are carried forward, and they may displace some of the needs in the second year. And you see where item 4 from 2020 is displacing item 2 in 2021. We apply a funding constraint again, which could be the same or could vary by year. We spend the money in priority order until it's exhausted. Those projects get funded, the rest get deferred. And this cascading calculation continues year after year after year. That works in the tool that we developed and applied for the MBTA and the MTA and previously at SEPTA. It's how Term Light works. The FTA tool is how all the various commercial products work as well. When the tool was originally developed for the MBTA in Boston, and this is going back that work began about 22 years ago, one of the reasons for developing that tool, and Aaron, you can advance the slide. One of the reasons that tool was developed was to convince the legislature that the new dedicated funding that became available to MBTA in 2000, that funding should be reserved to support operations and infrastructure renewal and not be diverted to use for system expansion. The tool was used to report back to the legislature in 2002 about necessary levels of funding. What was found in the application was that if they continued to spend at the then current level of $350 million a year, that the backlog would grow. It would grow from about $2 billion a year to about $5 billion a year over a 20-year period. Just to maintain the backlog at the then current level of $2 billion would require increasing the spending from $350 million a year to $450 million a year. And if the backlog was to be reduced to zero, say within 20 years, the spending would have to be increased even more, up to $610 million a year. This information, this is actual diagram from a 6-page brochure that was presented to the legislature in 2002, and it was sufficient to convince the legislature to reserve the then new dedicated funding just for operations and infrastructure renewal. A similar analysis was done in 2006. Similar message was sent to the legislature. And again, the funding was reserved for existing operations and infrastructure renewal. So I mentioned before that there is a prioritization basis for determining the order in which dollars are spent. in the work that we developed for MBTA and previously applied at SEPTA. It's summarized in this pie chart. Click again. Where every asset in every year that it's in the queue for consideration for renewal or replacement is scored against these 4 factors. Click again. The age factor uses a set of asset decay curves. Click again. The criticality measure is a risk-based measure, again, very much in keeping with best practices suggested by ISO 55000, that measures the probability of failure, again, using these asset decay curves, times the consequence of failure. And the consequence, in this case, is measured in terms of ridership. We heard in the session just before this one some approaches about assigning dollar values associated with risk. I've yet to encounter a transit agency that's really comfortable in reducing it down to dollar terms. Talking about riders affected seems to be a more accepted or acceptable way of addressing criticality. The third measure, click again, is operational impact, which is simply looking at comparing the cost of operating a new asset versus continuing to operate the old asset. And then the fourth measure is a scoring against a set of corporate or strategic goals. And there was a speaker in one of the prior sessions that talked about how that type of tool was being used by PennDOT. So we have a set of weightings for each of the 4 factors and a set of scores or ratings for each asset in each year that it's in the queue for consideration. We go through a pretty typical planning school type weighting and rating process to come up with a priority score for each asset in each year that it's in the queue for consideration for replacement. That was the basis for determining which assets were funded and which were not. So about 5 years ago, we applied this type of tool at SEPTA. And this was the SEPTA inventory at the time. This was work we did in around 2014 or 2015. All these are in 2012 dollars, about $21 billion worth of assets. And you see the distribution across the various funding classes. So we applied the tool, the decision support tool to these assets. And I'm going to show you a set of scenarios, beginning with an unconstrained scenario and then taking away money step by step to see what the effect is. So Aaron, click once again. So there's 4 graphs here. This is an unconstrained scenario. The size of the wedges of the pie chart are shown in the upper right. So half of the decision was made on the basis of age, condition, and performance, 20% on criticality, 20% on benefit costs, 10% on strategic goals. The upper right graph, the bars are showing the total need in each year. And because this is an unconstrained run, all those needs are funded exactly on time. This is measured against the axis on the left side. The red line is showing the size of the backlog measured against the scale on the right side. And we see that the backlog begins at around between $5 and $6 billion and quickly drops down to 0 within about 7 years. That's how long it would take to address all of the needs with a realistic spending profile, recognizing that some assets like acquiring rail cars takes a number of years, whereas some assets can be funded right away. The lower left graph shows the distribution of funding by asset class. The upper right graph shows the percentage of asset value at a state of good repair. And you see that once the backlog drops to 0 in about the 7th year, 100% of the assets are at a state of good repair. And then the lower right graph is showing the percentage of needs that are funded. And this is an unconstrained run, so all the assets are funded on time. All right, so that's the starting point. Now let's start taking money away. So rather than an unconstrained run, we limit it to just $1 billion a year. Well, you'll note from the prior graph that in the first couple of years, in an unconstrained world, we had spending in excess of $1 billion a year. You can see here that those needs are represented by the lighter orange color. We couldn't fund those on time. We had to spend them in later years, and we see some of that spending occurring. And the red line, which is the backlog, you can see that it takes longer to drop that backlog down to zero. No longer is it dropping to zero in the 7th year, it's dropping to zero in the 12th year. So as we take money away, it takes longer to bring the backlog down to zero. And we see that in the upper right graph that it takes a bit longer to get all of the asset value up to a state of good repair. And in the lower right graph, we see that in many cases, we're not fully funding all of the needs of all of the assets. Let's take some more money away. Click again. So we drop from $1 billion a year to $750 million a year. And that number just happens to be the level of funding to bring the backlog down to zero by the end of our analysis period. So we see the red line hitting zero at about the end of the analysis. And now we'll just click through rapidly, just a couple seconds for each. This was $750 million a year. This was $523 million. I forget exactly the meaning for that number, but I think it was it was a representative number of the then current capital program. And then we take money away some more to $500 million a year, and the backlog is just about stabilizing, and take a little bit more away. And at $373 million a year, we see that the backlog not only is not stabilizing, it's actually beginning to grow. And then I think we had one more. Yeah, this was a relatively low level of funding, unrealistically low, but we see if we had a really severe constraint on the capital program that the backlog would grow quite a bit. And we see that the percentage of assets in a state of good repair is starting to drop off over time, and we're not coming anywhere close to meeting the cumulative needs of all of the assets. So this is the type of scenario that we could do. We could do it across all assets, or we could look at it asset class by asset class. I've previously reported at the International Bridge Conference, just looking at SEPTA's roughly 350 bridges on the railroad, looking at what happens to condition on those assets over time. Click again, please, Aaron. So where do we go from here? Well, one, SEPTA is interested in applying a slightly more sophisticated decision support tool. We'll be doing that based on a current inventory, based on current conditions and current unit costs, reflecting all the various asset retirements and new acquisitions that have occurred since the last time we did this work about 5 years ago. The tool that we'll be using currently applied for the New York MTA as a new set of graphical reports, and it's on a new cloud-based platform, so it's a bit faster and a bit more user-friendly to use. Among the metrics that we'll be using in the next slide, they're summarized here, a set of performance measures and a set of spending measures. We've expanded the analysis a bit, looking at what the impact, or actually reporting back to the user, what the impact is of asset condition on annual O&M costs, particularly O&M costs for preventive and corrective maintenance. Next slide. So that's the end of the formal presentation. I welcome your questions. Hopefully we're going to get some questions. I'm not seeing any in the Q&A and none in the chat box yet. Let me throw some questions out there and see if we can get some discussion going. Aaron, go one more slide. It would be very interested to understand among the transit agencies in Pennsylvania and anybody else who is participating, what decision support tools are currently being applied. There's a couple of low-cost ones that are available out there. FTA has the Termite tool available on their website. Anybody can download it. There's training available on their website. The MBTA has their tool, which they've made available to several transit agencies around the country. The Transit Cooperative Research Program published the TAPT tool. It's a spreadsheet-based tool. There's no cost for any of those. There's a variety of commercial off-the-shelf tools. I've just listed the first couple of them in alphabetical order. There's several more that are out there. And these tools are a bit more sophisticated. Some of them get into the optimization aspect of the calculation in a bit more thorough way. Some are addressing operational sequencing and color of money constraints, which just make the analysis a bit more realistic. So that's one area where we'd be very interested in getting some feedback. Second area is exactly how are these tools being used? Beyond just jumping through the hoops that FTA is making transit agencies jump through, how useful is the findings from these analytical tools, both from a short-term tactical standpoint and from a longer-term strategic standpoint? Are these tools being very asset-specific? Are they supporting operational decision-making, and are they supporting capital decision-making? Again, we invite your questions in this area. The third area is how believable is all of this? Recognizing that these models never can completely represent the real world. How close are we to the actual decision-making that's going on? Thinking about that pie chart that I showed, and the 4 factors for prioritization. How realistic are those? Are there other factors that you're considering? And what's the relative importance of those factors? I can tell you that when the MBTA tool was first developed, the general manager of the agency who first conceived of the need of the tool recognized that there were many factors out there that it was not realistic to expect an analytical process to fully address. And he only saw the tool as being maybe 1/5 of the decision-making, recognizing that safety came first and drove a lot of the decision-making, that operational realities, particularly sequencing, could be something that couldn't be reduced to an analytical process, but it was a very real concern in terms of what actions could be taken before others. And then, frankly, there was just the pure politics, the need to spread the wealth throughout the region that might best not be addressed purely at an analytical level. So we'd like to see what questions you have. I see one just came in. Can you describe in more detail the difference between asset priority scoring and weight? Sometimes they seem to be related. Yeah, unfortunately, the terms are probably not the best terms. Aaron, go back to slide 9. Okay. Yeah, just to complete this, go through all the animation. So this is a weighting and rating calculation. The weights are the sizes of the wedges of the pie. There's no magic to the size of the weightings. The weightings here are not exactly what we were using in Boston. I think Boston was closer to what we used at SEPTA, which was a 50% age, condition, and performance, 20% criticality, 20% operational impact, 10% strategic goals. How you develop the size of the wedges of that pie, it could be just a decision by senior management. It could be the result of outreach to stakeholders, both within your organization, within a transit agency, and outside the transit agency, maybe including the MPO, local governments, maybe the state DOT. Or it could be the result of using an analytical tool. So, PennDOT, for example, is using the Decision Lens proprietary software. That tool was used in Boston at the MBTA to develop the size of the wedges of the pie in subsequent work. So that's the weighting. The rating is essentially an equation associated with each of the wedges that is calculated for each line item asset. So we have a score or a rating associated with age, condition, and performance, a rating or score associated with criticality, et cetera, for each asset. So we apply the overall weights to the asset-specific rates or scores to come up with a combined priority score for each asset in each year that it's in the queue waiting to be funded. I hope that answered the question. Not seeing any other questions yet. Again, one of the things I'd be very interested in is just understanding from the transit agencies what tools you're currently using. Anybody's willing to volunteer that? Okay, well, Steve, I think we were really efficient. Any other questions on Laura's presentation?
Yeah, you guys did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to our panelists. I do have a question that maybe Laura can expand on so that she can talk about the SEPTA experience, because I know that there was interest in hearing a little bit more about that from the attendance at the general session. So from my experience, and I'm sure from Bob's experience, we find that there's so many different types of assets involved with transit agencies. And so there's always that difficulty of figuring out what that right, level of detail is across different asset classes. How is SEPTA doing that for the new inventory that it's updating?
Laura, I think you're on mute.
Okay. So I don't know that there's an easy cut and dry answer to this question. And that's when we get this question a lot. People said, oh, well, what dollar value do you use? Or what level of person touches the asset and those sorts of things. And I mean, the fact of the matter is that a $200 widget in a substation can shut down my entire main line. So I encourage folks to take things to the maintainable unit and and I ask them what things would actually go to the decision-making process. Like if it's something that's going to get replaced as a part of routine maintenance, I would not include that in my decision-making score. I'm never going to decide whether or not I'm going to put a wooden tie back where there was a wooden tie kind of thing. But for larger investments, it's really you have to go back and forth, and I think the bigger conversation is the first time people give you this astronomical number to fix everything about this particular thing. And I know particularly in working in your model, something that costs $300 million is just never going to get funded. So really asking them, okay, how exactly do you propose to fix this thing? And how would we actually accomplish that as an agency over time? Those are kind of the conversations that you have to have those conversations before you really define what the asset granularity level is. We will, people that look at our inventory will sometimes say, well, wow, you have all of the bridges in each bridge is its own item, but then you have 100 buses bundled together. Why do you do that? And it's because it reflects how we would actually make decisions about the maintenance, operation, rehabilitation, and replacement of those assets.
Absolutely. And thank you for that response. I think it's so challenging to kind of figure out what that level of detail is. And I think you hit that on the nose with saying that it really depends on what the decision making is for that, project or asset in that sense for the next action.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the other part of that, it's a little bit of a tricky thing, especially if you're an outsider coming in and asking to tell me everything about what you do about your assets, so people think that you're auditing them. And you have to be really careful about how you present that and make sure that you don't feel that people are going to have their money taken away from their projects, or which is the big one, or even that you're critiquing, because the fact of the matter is most of these people have been taking care of these assets certainly longer than you or I have been working in asset management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe not Bob, but.
So I guess on that note, a follow up too, then, aside, or maybe it is a part of it, but what do you think was the most challenging aspect of implementing the TAM process at SEPTA was?
So there were maybe two things, 2 or 3. One is there was a perception that we were going to use this to take people's decision-making prowess away from them. And that was a particular concern for the vehicle engineering group. And I was kind of baffled when that happened, because I didn't think we had presented the project that way. And then I came to find out that maybe a year or 2 before I had started at SEPTA, someone had taken their money away from them. Mm-hmm. So we had been in a position where people said, oh, we've been spending too much money on the L, so no more money for vehicles for 5 years. And I was like, so then I come in and say, how do you invest in your vehicles? And like, go away. So there were things like that. Because the other thing was, at the time that we started the process was really at the beginning of when we went into our issues with funding in 2012, 2013, where people didn't even want to think about what the next action was on some of the assets, because they were like, we don't have any money. So even if I wanted to do things to these assets, they were so worried about keeping the system running and keeping it running in the current state. So it really took some iterative conversations to make sure that we're really talking about what is the next action for those particular assets, without also understanding that at the end of the day, we are not going to rip down all of the 1910 era catenary and put up constant tension things either, like to make sure that we're right sizing our recommended actions as well. So that it was an iterative process, and I certainly learned a lot about how to talk to different people about their areas of expertise throughout that.
I think those are all really good challenges that I'm sure a lot of other agencies have faced as well.
Yeah, and it is hard, because like when is the cutoff? I mean, do I say, hey, we're going to replace all of our buses with state-of-the-line electric buses? And not now anyway. Those sorts of conversations are tough. I guess the other thing that has been a challenge, and I think it's something that I'm looking forward to having the tools to do going forward, not necessarily with the tool that you're going to be working on for us, is that in the past, we've looked at a lot of the assets in a very discrete manner. Like, I'm going to replace a fleet of buses, or we're going to rehab Wayne Junction Station. We're getting into these questions like the trolley modernization program, where the 1981 Kawasaki trolleys are at the end of their useful life. We have to replace them. That's not in question, but the next thing is there are a lot of infrastructure challenges that have to be met as a part of that investment. And you have to start laying the groundwork for those decisions now. And those trolleys are not going to be coming on property for like 5 years. So having the asset management conversations is really helping to drive these long-term things that are not necessarily replace an asset in kind of decisions. And that applies to everything from the trolley signal system to what the future trolley stops are going to look like to where we're going to put them. Because the yards themselves are not configured for what I think we're going to be putting there. So those are all kinds of conversations that we need to be having that are a little bit beyond the what do you replace it with and when.
That is a good point. You know, a lot of times when we do these decision support tools, we're looking at the current inventory and, you know, replacing assets in kind, but oftentimes we're looking to do some sort of improvement on top of the existing asset. So that's a good example of where that would be a good area of investigation.
Right. And then you see that too with like the resilience type of projects as well as like the problem is that there's not something there to prevent this thing from happening, whether it be a slope failure or a stormwater issue or something. Those are the kinds of things that are a little harder to get into these tools. So I think that people just have to remember that it's a tool that it tell you what to do, but take a step back and look and make sure that this is really what you think, what needs to be done holistically for the agency.
Absolutely. I'll turn it over to give Bob another opportunity to talk a little bit about how the tool that he had presented on, you know, worked in that regard to how the MBTA used it in its original context. I believe it was not the be all end all in terms of how they made those decisions. It was just a component of their decision making, correct?
That's correct. It was conceived because of the then general manager's recognition that the capital programming process by the mid to late 90s was anything but fact-based. That essentially whoever had the loudest voice in the room got his or her projects. And they were constantly being surprised by needs that came up where, for all intents and purposes, the problem had not been thoroughly thought through. By moving toward a fact-based basis for, at the very least, identifying needs, the tool provided, was a contribution to the discussion. It was recognized from the beginning that these analytical devices are decision support tools. They're not decision-making tools. The results were always taken with a grain of salt and recognizing that at the very least, they're not addressing operational reality, that there are significant operational sequencing considerations, particularly in a rail environment that need to be addressed. But they were a start and a very useful one. At the very least, at the time, it forced the agency to develop and put into one place a comprehensive asset inventory, which it just didn't have previously. Now it does, and most agencies, through the implementation of enterprise asset management systems, ideally, or some type of computerized maintenance management information system, at least the inventory is getting quantified and enumerated in a similar format comprehensively across all assets.
Okay. I think maybe the last question for you then, Bob, is, we going back to kind of prompting our audience again too, to see if they have any questions as well. There's not a universal right tool to use, but what are some of the pluses and minuses or the drawbacks of, sizing the right tool or choosing the right tool for certain applications or agencies?
Well, recognizing that we are probably talking to an audience that's primarily representing smaller agencies, the TermWhite tool, which is a database tool, and the TAPT tool, which is a spreadsheet-based tool, are very competent in what they do. Any tool has limitations. They have limitations, but they're comprehensive, relatively sophisticated approach toward prioritization. Give the results that or that they meet at the very least the FTA requirements, and they go a bit beyond that as well. So these tools are very appropriate for smaller agencies. We use TermWhite in a broad range of contexts. We used it, and Aaron, you were involved in this. We used it to support Amtrak, looking at all of their fixed plant asset renewal needs in the Northeast Corridor, an asset inventory that contained nearly 90,000 asset line items. That was one extreme. The other extreme was we applied it for MatBus in Fargo, North Dakota, which has 25 buses. We only had 750 asset line items. And we specifically asked them, do you really want to use this sophisticated a tool? Where maybe you could do it in a spreadsheet, and they were very happy to proceed with using the TermWhite tool. And in their case, they didn't have much of a significant funding constraint, so it was just a convenient way to project out the needs. And it was a very detailed inventory, way more detailed than what FTA requires. I mean, every piece of maintenance equipment, for example, was identified. It's something which you don't have to do for in the FTA context. So I'm pretty optimistic that even the free tools, there's a context in which they can be applied.
Okay. Well, hopefully that information was useful for our audience. I know a lot of them are in the smaller agencies as well as the DOTs. So I know that these are tools that are available and can be used, and certainly can benefit the agencies. I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat. Give one last chance if there's a burning desire. But otherwise, I'd like to also take this time and opportunity to thank our speakers today for a good conversation on where we are in the transit industry with asset management, implementing it in SEPTA, and specifically talking about decision support tools. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Bob. And thanks also to Steve, who's been behind the scenes providing us assistance throughout the session.
I'd like to thank you guys as well, Aaron, as the program coordinator for the Asset Infrastructure Management Conference. I want to thank everyone who's participated as a speaker, as an attendee. I think it's been a very productive conference. As we are done a few minutes ahead of schedule, for those that are on this particular session, if you'd like to jump into one of the other sessions, catch the last few minutes of that, please feel free to do so. We also have closing remarks coming up at 3:15 from Dr. Eric Donnell, who is the director of the SciAmptus program, which is where this project has originated from. So I'd encourage you to join us then as well. So thank you, everyone. Laura, Aaron, Bob, thank you for all your efforts and work in putting the presentations together. And hopefully next year we can do it in person. And Laura, I promise you we will build in an ice cream social next year from the State Creamery. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.